Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. I want to thank Doug and the Conney project for having me, as well as the 92nd Street Y. I'm really excited to be back. I was here for my first book a few years ago, and it's exciting to be in this exact spot talking a little bit about the next book. So this paper is called, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Transmitting the Holocaust, Transcultural History and Racial Trauma in Contemporary Dances by African American Artists. In December 2007, choreographer Robert Battle's No Longer Silent premiered at Juilliard. Set to Erwin Schulhoff's 1925 Lola, a symphony evocative of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, No Longer Silent was one of 3 dances on a program performed to Holocaust-era music organized by James Conlon, the founder of the Oral Foundation, an organization that's dedicated to performing music suppressed by the Nazis. In 2015, to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, Battle restaged the ballet on the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, which he's directed since 2011. Now, coincidentally, 2 months after the 2007 debut of No Longer Silent at Juilliard, Donnell Byrd and the Seattle-based company Spectrum Dance Theater premiered the Theater of Needless Talents, a Holocaust-themed work set to Schulhoff's jazz-inflected pieces for piano, violin, and cello. Byrd learned about Schulhoff when he attended a concert produced by the Music of Remembrance, which is an organization that's very similar to Oral Foundation, and like Battle, he recently restaged the work for a national tour. No Longer Silent and Theater of Needless Talents are aesthetically, choreographically, and thematically distinct, and yet what binds them is not coincidental. So I'm currently working on a new book project that's called Holocaust Dances, Representing the Holocaust in Contemporary Dance, which examines representations of the Shoah in dances created between 1960 and the present, and demonstrates that dance has served as a fertile platform for making an embodied intervention into an immensely complex history of trauma and loss, intolerance and bigotry. Interestingly, some of the most significant works in the US to address the Holocaust in the last decade have been by prominent African American choreographers, Battle, Byrd, and most recently, Bill T. Jones. Today, I'm going to analyze the Theater of Needless Talents and No Longer Silent in order to consider the Holocaust as a transcultural, transhistorical event that speaks to issues of persecution, trauma, and survival, themes that resonate with a long history of racial violence in the US. Now, Byrd and Battle certainly connected to the Holocaust as African Americans. Still, these dances are not simply expressions of connections between Black and Jewish histories. In fact, both men related to this history as artists. Drawn to Schulhoff's experimental rigor and love of jazz, they aimed through their dances to give body to the music and life of a like-minded artist silenced by the Holocaust. Donnell Byrd is a prolific, Tony-nominated choreographer whose work spans concert dance, Broadway, and opera, well known for works that include The Minstrel Show from 1991, which is a fearless and controversial examination of racial stereotyping, and 2008's A Chekhovian Resolution, which explored the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As a choreographer, Byrd has stated that he aims to represent, quote, love, death, obsession, joy, fate, desire, revenge, hate, war and peace, the whole range of a human's being on stage. Growing up in the 1950s in the segregated South, Byrd was raised by a grandfather who worked for his entire life in a kosher bakery. Consequently, he spent a lot of time with Jewish people. I used to describe Jews as the other white people, he told me, the nicer white people. Byrd's characterization of Jews as the other white people is reminiscent of Eric Sundquist's discussion of African Americans as America's Jews in his book, Strangers in the Land. Now, I can't delve deeply today into the complex history of parity and disparity between Jews and Blacks in the US, though in the early 20th century, both were considered lesser Americans. Cross-identification was complicated by the assimilation of Jews into the middle class and whiteness at mid-century. As America's Jews, Sundquist wrote, Blacks were far more likely to bear the brunt of racism, a fact that made Jews sympathetic to their predicament because it reminded them of the pogroms they had escaped and might face once again, but for the scapegoat provided by the American black. Sundquist also showed how black writers identified with Jewish struggles through their interest in Exodus and the Holocaust as, quote, conceptual frameworks for reinterpreting the ordeal of slavery and its legacy in racial discrimination. And he pointed to jazz as a means through which Jewish and black Americans have told, quote, a story of absorption and resistance. Byrd's and Battle's dances demonstrate the continuation of such crossings. Now, Schulhoff was born in Czechoslovakia of German Jewish descent. Trained as a pianist, he was an experimenter who brought together diverse musical influences, including neoclassicism, atonality, jazz, ragtime, dada, and cabaret. A communist, he applied for and received Soviet citizenship in 1941, but was arrested before he could escape and died in Würzburg in 1942. About the first time he heard Schulhoff's music, Byrd recalled, quote, I was just blown away. It was the most amazing piece of music I'd ever heard. He set out to learn more, recalling, I just felt so sad about what the world lost by the death of this man. And it made me think about 6 million and the contributions that those people might have made. That's why the Holocaust to me was an unimaginable tragedy in terms of the impact that it had and what might have been. I just also identified with Schulhoff, any composer who liked dancing and jazz, that's my kind of composer. Byrd also researched artists at Terezin, particularly Karl Svink, who organized satirical cabarets there, which we learned about a little bit yesterday from Naomi and Edward. And before his arrest, had a theater company in Prague called the Theater of Needless Talents. So the Theater of Needless Talents, the dance piece, is an ambitious dance that weaves together numerous threads, including ruminations on the role of performance in the Holocaust, and non-narrative sequences that kinesthetically converse with Schulhoff's music. It begins and ends with a powerful scene that situates the tragedy of these artists' death in relation to genocide more broadly. So the curtain rises on 12 men and women standing center stage, dressed in hats and coats and shoes. On the ceiling, you'll see that there is an interlocking cubes inspired by Peter Eisenman's Memorial to the Murdered Jews. Perhaps you've seen that. And the set's geometry is mirrored on the floor by a large grid outlined with tape in which the dancers stand. They start to shift their weight side to side, marching in place, and perform a series of gestures in almost compulsory unison while reciting grim statistics.
In Czechoslovakia, an estimated 277,000 Jews were murdered during the Holocaust.
In Austria, an estimated 65,000 Roma people were murdered during the Holocaust.
In Denmark, an estimated 628 non-Jews were murdered during the Holocaust.
In Denmark, it's estimated that 100 Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust.
In Austria, an estimated 10,000 non-Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust.
Czechoslovakia is estimated 7,500 Roma people were murdered during the Holocaust.
In Albania, an estimated 200 Jews were murdered during the Holocaust.
In Estonia, an estimated 1,000 non-Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust.
After this first phrase, other way, yes. Okay, thank you. Oh, not so much, because then I can't see. Just so they can see. Is that better? That's good, right there. No.
I don't think we have a choice.
Okay, I think we'll leave it. Never mind. Oh, not that way, though. It's a comedy of errors at the most awkward moment. Right there. Okay, leave it. No, let's leave it. That's good. We'll deal. All right. So, after this first phrase, the dancers pause, allowing the statistics to sink in before recommencing their litany of death and movement. They add more gestures and pick up the pace, viscerally emphasizing the surging number of deaths. The scene ends with dancers removing layers of clothing and exiting the grid. One dancer remains inside, lying in a pile of discarded clothes, recalling images, prone corpses, clothes and shoes without bodies, prevalent in Holocaust iconography. Now, as you could hear, the performers named many categories of victims, not only Jews, encouraging the identification of viewers across religious, ethnic, and national lines. In fact, Byrd aimed through this work to build awareness and incite action. We should ask ourselves why, he says, even 65 years after the Holocaust, when the world asserted never again, genocide still persists. This section is repeated at the end of the evening with several critical differences, most notably the recitation of deaths from violence in North Korea, Laos, Cambodia, Burundi, Pakistan, Bosnia, Rwanda, Sudan, etc. Although the theater Needless Talents begins and ends with political commentary, the bulk of the piece stems from Byrd's inquiry into the role of performance in the camps. Why in the face of imminent death, he asked, did people still choose to create and perform? Were these performances moments of respite, morale-boosting actions, acts of defiance, or just another insidious act of terror perpetrated by the SS to further dehumanize? This portion of the work is framed by quotes, such as this one from an Auschwitz survivor on performance in the camps. Why would I get involved in it? You sing and dance for the devil because you will not let him kill you. The music references ragtime and jazz, while the movement nods to vaudeville through dancerly sketches. The lively dancing masks desperation, as in this section which hints at homophobic violence in camps.
At Auschwitz, I saw a man who could sing as both a tenor and a soprano. The SS guards made him dress up like a man on his right side and a woman on his left, and he would perform for the camps by alternating sides. He would sing the Fledermaus by Johann Strauss, and the SS guards would laugh and laugh, while the prisoners who were healthy enough stood by and watched. Klaus S.
Ensemble listlessly applauds, implicating all of us as witnesses to and participants in this humiliation. While much of the dance's narrative, the bravest aspect of the work is Byrd's insistence on conversing with Schulhoff's music outside the narrative frame as an equally significant commemorative act. This distinction is indicated choreographically and spatially, so when the dancers are inside the grid, they embody the past, but when they step outside, they are free to play with the music. In the theater Needless Talents, Byrd attempted to layer past and present, narrative and abstraction, Holocaust and other genocides, a compositional tactic that results in a somewhat fractured piece. In contrast, Robert Battle's No Longer Silent, so I was going to show you the video clip. I'll leave it if you want to see it later. So, in contrast, Robert Battle's No Longer Silent effectively synthesizes his Holocaust narrative with both music and history. Battle, who's 20 years younger than Byrd, was also born in the South. He attended Juilliard, then danced with David Parsons before founding his own company, Battleworks, in 2002. And a decade later, he became artistic director of Alvin Ailey. No Longer Silent is, I believe, the first dance Battle set on the Ailey Company in his new role, and the serious heft of the piece is distinct from the company's often celebratory repertory. No Longer Silent is a weighty and unrelenting dance that depicts the dehumanization of the Jews by the machinery of fascism. And I was really struck by how its aesthetic is deeply immersed in Schulhoff's score, and thus, for me anyway, in a very pleasurable way, recalls the stark modernism of Nijinsky, Nijinska, and early Martha Graham. So Battle also found Schulhoff's music really resonant. I connected with the denseness and drama in the music, he said. He initially felt unqualified to comment on the Holocaust, but once he honed in on a theme, he ran with it. The reason I call it No Longer Silent, he says, is that silence is the oppressor's greatest weapon, and that by staging silence histories, we may learn not to repeat them. Thus, through this dance he states, Schulhoff is no longer silent. They, the Jews, are no longer silent. Although Battle discusses the narrative as loosely following Schulhoff's life, it is the group choreography that stuns. When the curtain rises, the stage is bare, save for a bench that extends across the entire back wall. 18 dancers enter in several waves. They march, skitter on their knees, or reach up imploringly with outstretched fingers, alternatively suggesting exile, prayer, and begging for one's life. The dancers are engulfed in overlarge suits reminiscent of Hasidic Jews, but definitively abstracted. The lines sewn across their legs mark them, like Jewish stars, as other, while removing their individuality. The choreography embodies the intricate layering of the score through the continual formation, unraveling, and reformation of groups. Moments of stillness are juxtaposed with moments of cacophony. Sometimes the music rages on while the dancers freeze, as if immobilized. For example, there's one striking moment when the dancers pause downstage, jammed into a tight line, their faces outlined by a bright sliver of light as they seem to peer out of the slats of a cattle car. The music is rich and ruthless, and Battle's choreography is rigorous. At times, the dancing is mechanistic, which gives the piece a fascist edge, the dancers evoking a cogs in a wheel. Sometimes the dancers' circular movements create a sense of folkish community, but more often than not, dancers appear trapped as they march, shuffle, fall, and stand again on quivering legs. While the piece undoubtedly represents a victimization, it also depicts anger and resistance. The long bench set along the back of the stage and the dancing that occurs with and around it functions as the work's primary symbol for victimization and resistance. The most extended bench section takes place against a deep fuchsia backdrop. The dancers stomp and pulsate, creating a driving, obsessive orchestra with their bodies. For Battle, this section is about, quote, the rage of being stuck. The desire to fight back is paired with powerlessness, which is what connects Jewish oppression to, as Battle puts it, oppression in this country.
A lot of the images that I looked at are directly related to the dance and some of the images you see in the dance. And I saw a lot of images of people sitting on benches. And there was something about that metaphor of the bench, being benched, a certain sense of hopelessness. It's like being told to sit down. You know, I was sort of going into that psychology. And so that's why I wanted the bench. And the dancers keep returning to the bench, even when they have moments of what looks to be they're fighting through. Eventually they turn and return to the bench. So that imagery really sort of drove the work, and certainly his personal story.
So in his research, Battle became fixated on archival images of benched, emaciated prisoners, which reminded him of working class folks in the US, quote, waiting for buses, doing manual labor, you know, old men sitting, and how you can see the effects of labor in their bodies. The bench also bars dancers from leaving, yet, there's another strong image of the bench. Yet at the end, it rises on one side, creating an opening in front of which Schulhoff stands. There's no exit, however. The curtain falls before you can escape, and the ensemble keeps shuffling along. The Holocaust is an overwhelming history to represent, a challenge that can be amplified by often unstated prescriptions about who gets to represent it and how. And yet, through Schulhoff's music, Byrd and Battle found a way in. Once in, they managed to create pieces that address the horrors of the Holocaust, while making the radical decision to also indulge in the beautiful complexity of the music and the pure pleasure of choreographing to it. I would like to end by suggesting that these dances have changed since they first premiered in 2007. Restaging these works in 2012 and 2015 placed them in a political context that included increased attention in the mainstream media to institutionalize violence against African Americans, and therefore these revivals have created deeper resonances between the Jewish persecution presented on stage and the persecution of people of color in this country. Significantly, the 2008 cast of Theater of Needless Talents, this is the cast that you saw in the video, is almost entirely white, while the 2012 cast was much more diverse. Similarly, the Juilliard cast for No Longer Silent was mostly white, whereas the Ailey Company is primarily black. When black and brown bodies embody these Jews and tell their stories, the associations between Jewish and black Holocausts are laid bare. Battle's decision to present No Longer Silent on programs of newer works that address the incarceration of black men and Black Lives Matter further emphasizes how the Holocaust can function as a lens to reflect upon both Jewish and black histories of persecution. But this is not enough. As Battle says, if we don't continue to tell these stories, we will continue to repeat them. So as an artist, my role really is not just to tell my own story. There are prisons of the world that connect us all. Thank you.